Hello everyone, I'm Wael Taleb, a journalist at Lorient Today and the co-host of the Beirut Banyan now.
And my name's David Wood. I'm the senior Lebanon analyst for International Crisis Group, a conflict prevention organization. I've been living in Beirut for 5 years, and I think for 3 of them I've known the handsome Wael Taleb.
This is not true, not the handsome poet and not the 3 years poet.
Okay, so which part's more true, the handsome or the 3 years?
I don't know.
Let's say 2 years.
No, it's even less, man.
Oh my word.
Yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun, right?
But we know each other professionally, but also now, because we've talked a lot about politics enough times now, we get along better, I suppose.
Absolutely.
This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, The Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is The Beirut Banyan.
This pattern of escalation that we've been talking about for several weeks now, which is that there are several different potential explanations for why Israel's doing what it's doing. I think one that is quite persuasive is that, as we know in Lebanon, Hezbollah has developed a pattern of retaliating for every escalation by Israel, but minus a certain margin.
Yep.
So as to avoid a massive spiral of escalation. So retaliating, but not at the same level as what Israel has done. So one potential explanation for these kinds of targeted strikes is that Israel sees this as an opportunity to take out Hezbollah-aligned infrastructure, and that could help to explain the attack in Baalbek. Another thing that occurred to me yesterday is that obviously most of Israel's strikes have been concentrated in the south of Lebanon, but we all remember the strike in Dahya, which resulted in the assassination of Salah al-Aruri. And then the third major area that was targeted by Israeli strikes in the 2006 war, the last major conflict between the parties, was in the Bekaa Valley. I mean, if you look at a map of where the missile strikes were concentrated in 2006, the third of the top 3 areas is Baalbek and in the Bekaa Valley. So perhaps this is also an effort by Israel to apply pressure on the ongoing discussions or could turn into negotiations about changing the security situation at the border. Who knows? It could be a combination of all those things.
Why would Hezbollah escalate things and shoot a $2 million drone? You were talking about them retaliating and like a less of an intensity than Israel. So why would they escalate things in this sense?
I mean, I think that at some point, as I said, Hezbollah has taken this very calibrated approach to responding. But equally, as we know, there's this idea of mutual deterrence, right? And I think we've all heard a lot about this, especially since the 7th of October. And this idea that Hezbollah and Israel feel that they need to prove to the other side that they're willing to go all the way. And therefore, it's kind of like poker, a game that I'm terrible at, so I'll mangle this analogy and you can help me with it.
But I should win, yeah.
You'll definitely take my money off me because I don't actually have any strategy when it comes to poker. But I try to win psychologically by using a bluff, which is where even if I don't have good cards, I might be able to beat you without actually using my cards, if I can convince you I have strong cards. Mutual deterrence, to my mind, operates something like that. It's that it's 80% psychological. Each side wants the other to believe that it is a threatening enough military power and is willing to act on that power so that the costs of and all that escalation outweigh any potential benefits. So for this reason, while Hezbollah has been very committed and disciplined in these calibrated responses, perhaps one way to explain the attack on this drone was to remind Israel that it does have better capacity in terms of air defence than it did when the parties last had a major conflict in 2006. That's one explanation.
Would you agree that Hezbollah has been tested enough times that it won't start a full-scale war? Not impossible, but the way it appears.
I think that there's been a clear pattern established, right, which is that Hezbollah has resisted calls from Hamas in the early days of the conflict to intervene more forcefully. Hezbollah has resisted sustained attacks on its own fighters, on communities where many of its supporters live, and has remained committed to this policy of matching Israel minus X, but also of not pausing until there's an end to Israeli aggression in Gaza. And I still believe that despite yesterday's events, that seems to be the course that the party has set for itself and that it's most likely to continue.
So then Israel can, in theory, get away with everything it does in Lebanon. Like, not everything, but in a lot of things. And that's why it's testing the water slowly. Like, for example, there was the Sar Haruri assassination. Hezbollah did not, Muhannad pointed out in my interview with him that Nasrallah at some point had said that if they strike Dahi, Tel Aviv would be struck, and that didn't happen. And then around Saida, Jadra was struck, which is like, Jadra is in Mount Lebanon, by the way. Like it's not even on the south, it's close to Saida. And then Ghazi was struck, which is very deep as well, in the south. And now the Baalbek strikes. Like, are the Israelis like are the Israelis testing the water slowly because they know that they can get away with a lot of things?
If we look at something like these strikes that are happening in or close to civilian areas and why Israel is doing them, then sure, I think that one plausible explanation is that, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, like that there's an opportunistic element to this that would be persuasive. So if Israel were to have military targets related to Hezbollah, then now would seem to be the time to attack them. I mean, if this was done on the 6th of October 2023, when the old rules of engagement or rules of the game between the parties were in place, it would seem much riskier than when Hezbollah has demonstrated this pattern over several months of calibrated retaliation rather than taking a further step up the escalation ladder, if you will. So I think that that's one plausible explanation, for sure.
Yeah, and like even before the Ghazi strike and the Jadra strike, things were escalating slowly, in terms of targeted assassinations, the severity of the attacks. We see massive destruction in the south now, as opposed there was destruction in the beginning, but as far as I remember, at the beginning, the outskirts of the village used to be bombed. Then it got closer to actual villages, and now we see total who knows how much destruction there is. There's not good numbers on that, but there's total destruction to some villages. So it's not a full scale war yet, but it's been on the escalating, slowly, but it's been escalating. So
and it's notable, right, that Hezbollah has not inflicted anywhere near the same amount of damage on Israeli civilians or Israeli civilian areas, right? Also,
do you think, like genuinely, do you think that when Hezbollah inflicts casualties, do you think they do that oftentimes by mistake?
Like as civilian casualties?
Yes.
Possibly, but I mean, I couldn't read the minds of Hezbollah's leadership on this front. But what I do know is that there are fewer civilian targets for Hezbollah to hit simply because the entire kind of border strip to a certain number of kilometers inside northern Israel has been evacuated. So, I mean, we know that Hezbollah has the firepower to hit major civilian areas if it wants to. That's a clear choice not to do that. But many of these strikes that we've seen in retaliation for Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon have fallen in areas that have been evacuated by civilians. If you remember, I think it was about a month ago, that a mother and her son, who were civilians, not military personnel, died from an anti-tank missile attack, I believe, that originated from Lebanon. And in fact, as I understand it, what had happened is that the mother and son had refused to evacuate. They weren't meant to be there is the point. They were just there because they said, no, we want to keep living in our home for whatever reason. So in that case, it's reasonable to believe that Hezbollah had no idea that these people would be there.
Yeah.
Because obviously, as we know, Nasrallah mentioned, or at least floated the idea in his first speech after this round of conflict broke out, that there might be a principle of Hezbollah taking a civilian life for every civilian that died in Lebanon from an Israeli attack.
Yeah,
now, obviously,
he said al-Madani bil-Madani, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Now, and I think that that's not just because of this reason that I mentioned, which is that not so many there are barely any Israeli civilians near the border. I think that you're right. Like, part of this is a calculated strategy by Hezbollah, again, to make sure that there is a retaliation, but it's not likely, if at all likely, to push the situation into an uncontrollable spiral of escalation.
I'm not right here because I'm not advocating any opinion. I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Absolutely, as you always do.
Let's last point about the Baalbek strike. We can both agree that the reason they struck Baalbek is not a military purpose, as in there was no very valuable target in Baalbek that they couldn't avoid striking, and that's why they struck Baalbek. There's plenty of targets in the south to strike, but they chose to strike Baalbek area, right? As a political message to Hezbollah.
Well, that's certainly not what they claimed officially, right? Like, their official claim was that it was related to the air defense system.
Yeah, that's what they said. Yeah, but
worth mentioning.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, as I said, I think it builds pressure, or it's intended to build pressure on Hezbollah to negotiate. And also, I have no idea whether the strike was intended to hit this food depot. But if it's connected to El Sajjad, like something like that, which goes to the social welfare support aspect of Hezbollah, is something that's very important to its supporters. Not just during the economic crisis. So I think that the strike in Baalbek, as you kind of suggesting, I think, is probably symbolic. But there is a symbolism to it, which is probably intended at least to apply military pressure to negotiations in much the same way, by the way, as Israel seems to be doing in relation to Gaza, is using force to influence negotiations, in this case at the minute, over a hostage release deal.
Something we were discussing earlier is that compared to 2006, all of Lebanon was targeted, across Lebanon, there were targets, yes, but it was mostly focused on the south, the Bekaa, and Dahi. And now there is not consistent strikes on these areas, but the status quo is getting close, very slowly, of course, but getting closer to these other areas that are always risky, at risk. So the status quo is not very different than 2006. It's not a full-scale war, and Beirut is maybe isolated. But these areas, I think their residents, the status quo is not very different to 2006. What do you think?
I think it would be hard to argue that the current strikes are clearly the 2006 war was more intense.
I was here the whole time. I'm saying it's slowly, without us noticing, because it's a slow escalation. It's slowly getting there. With enough time, God knows how much time it will. This war will take. With enough time, it might reach that level without us noticing that it reached that level. Without a full-blown escalation that will happen suddenly.
It's kind of like the frog in boiling water analogy.
Yeah.
What's worth considering here is that it seems unlikely to me that Israel would want to open two fronts at once, fully open two fronts. So we know that there are negotiations that are ongoing for some kind of temporary ceasefire.
Would or wouldn't, you said?
Wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I think that would make sense. It's never a good idea to have two fronts open for any belligerent, right?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's not even specific to the situation.
From a military perspective.
And then you read these reports which suggest that quite simply Israel doesn't have the capabilities on its northern border right now to launch a ground invasion of southern Lebanon or something like that. So I think that while the hostilities remain at a high level in Gaza, it's less likely that there would be a full-scale war initiated by Israel along the Lebanese-Israeli border. The question, of course, then becomes what happens if there is a temporary ceasefire in Gaza? Because, there's already Israeli leaders who are saying that when this happens, the next step for Israel is to move to the north.
Yeah.
Israel made very public and in a very non-subtle way that reservists who've recently been released from Gaza were told to be ready for active service in the north from April. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean that Israel is planning to invade Lebanon in the next few weeks. It could be a pressure tactic. I think this comes back to mutual deterrence. This idea that you need, like each side needs the other to believe that it's prepared to go all out, and that is the deterrent factor. So I'm not predicting a war in Lebanon, but I'm also saying it can't be discounted. What I do think is it's very unlikely so long as the hostilities continue at a relatively high level in Gaza, just for practical reasons.
Yeah, as you said, like the Israeli statements were like increasing in terms of intensity. And then we would say that, but they've been stating these, making these statements since the beginning of the war. But then they struck Baalbek. Like they actually kind of met their statements. Not completely, but like when they make crazy statements, not crazy, like statements such as, we will strike, did they say Kaslik and whatever?
Sure.
Yeah. Should we take like, of course we would take it seriously, but should we, how serious are these statements?
I think that the strike in Baalbek is serious, as any military strike is in this battle, and it's entering into literally new territory. It's the deepest strike in terms of distance that has happened since the latest round of conflict broke out. So for all those reasons, it should be taken seriously. I also think that just given the pattern that's been established, it doesn't necessarily reflect an intention of Israel to start like a phased escalation into an all-out war. Look, as I understand it from the outside, the thing is, and what makes the job for my job and also yours as a journalist difficult in answering this question is, it's clear even to outsiders like us that the Israeli leadership is hopelessly divided. People have suffered this incredible psychological trauma after the 7th of October. And for those reasons, it's very unclear exactly what is going to happen. What I understand from my colleague, who is an excellent researcher who works on Israel, Meirav Zonzin, is that there is some of the Israeli political and military leadership has been saying for years that something needs to be done about Hezbollah, something serious, some kind of military solution, and that now is a better time than any to do it. There is that argument out there. Also, the viewers might remember, and I'm sure you do, that I think it was on the 11th of October, there was this meeting that was held by the Israeli War Cabinet where there was a debate about whether to preemptively strike Lebanon. And it's unclear who it was at this meeting who talked Netanyahu and whoever was supporting him in this idea out of it. Some say it was Biden himself. Others say it was someone like Gadi Eisenkot. But the point is that there were voices in the room in the war cabinet saying this is a strategic error. Don't do it. What that makes me believe, again, as someone who's an outsider to all this, is that there are still leaders in Israel who realize that it would be madness in a military sense, like absolute madness, to enter into full-scale war with Hezbollah.
Why?
Because of the consequences.
Yeah, and in what sense?
Because it's been tried several times before by Israel in the past few decades, and it never works. In 1978, chasing the PLO up to the Litani and occupying southern Lebanon up to the Litani. In 1982, going all the way to Beirut, trying to install a friendly government. That failed. During the 1990s, trying to create a kind of security buffer zone through occupation with the assistance of a proxy military force. Didn't work, left in 2000, withdrew. 2006, similar kind of aim to what is apparently being done now in relation to Hamas, which is to eliminate the threat of Hezbollah. Didn't work. So my point is that, I mean, even if you look at it in terms of what Israel's military objectives are, I just don't see a military solution to them, certainly not in terms of full-scale war. And I would say this because I work for a conflict prevention organization, but the smartest way out of this, and the best way for both sides really, is to negotiate and find some kind of political settlement.
Look, I would agree with you that the military action was not effective in most of these wars. When it comes to the PLO, though, to be fair, they did kick the PLO out of Lebanon, so they succeeded.
And they went to Tunis.
Yeah. But they kicked them out of Lebanon. But what
Sure,
was
sure.
what the defeat about this occupation is that they decided to stay in Lebanon, and they were forced out of Lebanon. Yeah, that didn't work. But the PLO, but the difference, what I'm saying is the difference between the PLO and Hezbollah is the Hezbollah are the residents of these villages. How can you kick the residents of these villages out? The PLO, however, were a foreign entity, mostly hated by Lebanese residents, like we all remember. This is maybe people, it's an unfortunate thing, and it's not a nice thing to say. But when Israel occupied Lebanon in 1982, the south at first, people, the residents of the south, some of them threw rice on the Israelis, some of them, in celebration of it, because they were so fed up by the PLO. So yeah, it's different. What I'm saying is it's different between Hezbollah and the PLO. But when it comes to Israel, you're saying military action would have negative consequences on the Israeli side. Can you imagine a scenario where they would like militarily, like if they are not winning with Hamas, for example, if they are failing with Hamas, can you imagine a scenario where they would succeed militarily in Lebanon?
This is where politics comes in, right? So, and again, I'm not a military analyst, but of course we know that countries don't always go to war for good reasons or for like cogent reasons. Politics is at play, and as I mentioned, it seems to me that in Israel their leadership is desperately in search of a political victory, you know, and they don't seem to be getting that victory in Gaza as things stand. I mean, they promised the Israeli people like the elimination of the threat from Hamas, like the elimination of Hamas. Like, how do you kill an idea? And you know, all it would take is a Hamas operative, or you know, a group representing Hamas to emerge in Gaza and say the resistance continues, and that would be and that could be claimed as a victory by Hamas. You know, just pure survival. I don't think, and I certainly hope that we're not going to see any level of conflict which would put Hezbollah in a similar situation. But it's an asymmetrical battle. This has always been the problem: is that Israel has promised to change the situation of security at the border and remove the threat of Hezbollah. And that's an incredibly high bar to clear. And for that reason, perhaps, and this is something that I've been speaking about with my colleagues recently, is what is worrying is what if Israel could only achieve something like, let's say, a half victory in Gaza? Would it try to complement that with a half victory against Hezbollah? What do you think about that idea?
What is the half victory in Gaza now?
A half no, my point, like from the Israeli perspective, might be eliminating a certain number of leaders. Like, I don't know what it is, sending someone to exile.
That's whom they taken out.
Sure, but you know, my point is like
I'm saying what, like, as of now, is there even, can they even make that argument, that claim that there's a half victory? You think?
No, I'm not saying that they can. Oh, no, absolutely.
I'm not saying
no.
But can you imagine?
Not right now. And for me, the objective is so ambitious and so it sets such a high bar for itself that I actually I can't personally imagine how that could be achieved.
Yeah.
Maybe using the word half was wrong. A partial, what could be claimed as a partial victory, and then trying to supplement that with a partial victory. The idea being, okay, Israel might say something like it failed to eliminate Hamas as a complete threat and it failed to eliminate Hezbollah as a threat, but it reduced both of those groups' capacity to inflict harm or something like that. My point is this, like, we can argue about the details, but the point is that, yeah, I do think that if Israel's not achieving its objectives in Gaza, it doesn't necessarily mean that Israel will say it's time to move towards diplomacy. It is possible that Israel will seek some kind of military victory at the northern border, which is incredibly concerning.
How would they solve this northern concern of their own people, you think?
How would they solve it?
Yeah, the northern concern, the continuous Hezbollah threat on the north. What would they...
But you made a great point before, right? And that is, like, this idea of pushing back Hezbollah from the border. It's hard to imagine how that works in practice, because what about Hezbollah fighters who are residents of villages along the border? What do they, like, do these guys just never live in their home again? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and how are these people identified? And
Then what would they have to get for them to solve that concern? Can you imagine something? Like a victory, quote unquote,
Sure. I mean, there could be some kind of partial implementation of 1701. There could be other...
Which what would increase Lebanese army presence?
Yeah, sure, something like that.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, if having Lebanese army, increased Lebanese army presence, I personally can't imagine why Hezbollah would have a problem with that.
Yeah, so why would Hezbollah agree to that?
I think Hezbollah will want something in return.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. What would Hezbollah have to get, in your opinion? You're a political analyst. One of my expertise is politics.
We're heading into extreme levels of speculation here, but
Yeah.
I'll forgive you because it's my first time doing this podcast. What about reduced flyovers? What about concessions on the land border?
Yes.
Stuff like that, maybe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As in, like, I
Okay,
think
withdrawal from occupied areas as well.
what's potentially. I mean, look, it's obviously a whole other can of worms that would be opened if, look, with the land border, for example. So you've got Amos Hochstein, coming and trying to kickstart these negotiations to get the parties away from the logic of warfare towards the logic of diplomacy and negotiation. 7 of those 13 points are like it's a tree here or like a bush there or a stone there. Like they can be easily resolved. But others are more complicated, and one of them is Rajah. Yeah, Rajah. Like there's clearly, I think, a few hundred people who are Israeli citizens but are living on the Lebanese side of the blue line.
Yeah.
Do you know what? Like, just pragmatically
and as far
speaking,
as I understand, they don't want to be in Lebanon. They want to be in Israel.
no, exactly. So the point is that there's going to be resettlement involved there. That's just one example of how. It's not to say that the land border situation can be resolved, but anyone who thinks that the land border can be demarcated in like the next few weeks and that will avert a war is living in a dreamland. I mean, it took 10 years to demarcate the maritime border, and that was just dividing, sea and
But there
money.
are channels now, like that's positive.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's like the maritime border succeeded.
Yeah, but now you're dividing people's houses.
Yeah.
Like
You
the only
mean
houses
yeah.
being divided by the maritime border
Yeah.
are like houses of fish.
And let's be clear, like Hezbollah and their statements refer to Mount Tirel, Lake Fashuba and Wazira Shaba as Lebanese territories. Technically, they are disputed. Like we don't know if they are Syrian or Lebanese. Technically, they are still disputed. So we don't know if they are going to be part of that.
Well, with Shibar, definitely the Syrians need to be in the room.
Yeah.
Like definitely like with Shibar Farms.
Yeah, we have to demarcate the land with Syria as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the Mount Fashuba, Tirel Fashuba, we call them. Yeah.
I'm not trying to be cynical. For once in my life, I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm not trying to denigrate those efforts because, again, I think the logic of negotiating is great if it can buy time, and this is why I think time's really important. Is that what from Israel's perspective, their leaders are always saying that their residents need to feel safe again after this great shock that happened on the 7th of October. But if there's a ceasefire, like let's say there's a permanent ceasefire at some point in the future, and Hezbollah honours its pledge to stop fighting, so the border falls quiet. As time goes by, human nature would suggest that more and more residents of North Israel and residents of South Lebanon will return to their homes. I mean, already aren't we seeing more and more people going back to the south on the weekends, for example?
Not just on the weekends. After the truce, David, after the first, the truce in Gaza, which reflected on Lebanon, there were a lot of people who were shy to stay at their families, relatives' houses, because this war is taking a lot of time. So they prefer to stay in their border areas houses, than to be at a relative's house, for example.
Exactly.
Or to be at school. So even especially that now Lebanon is suffering from an economic crisis, people sometimes prefer to stay at their home, and they have agricultural land as well. This is a fact. I can only speak about the Lebanese side because I know the
But I mean, but we can imagine, let's say that the guns fall silent. Let's say that Israel doesn't follow through on its threats to expand its military campaign, and there's some calm on the border. This is a good situation, right? the family in the hotel room, even if they're not an economic burden on their families like in Lebanon, who are also going through an economic crisis, it gets pretty old living in one room and sharing a bathroom. So as time goes by and more people from their communities go back to the borderlands and send them Instagram videos saying that the situation's fine, it's very calm and so on and so forth, the more that kind of in a de facto way that sense of security will be restored. So to come back to my point, what's the best hope for a way out of this is permanent ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, we all want that for reasons that are not even directly related to the border, but like that's just one of the many reasons that this should happen. Then if that happens, and then if the parties take stock in their stability at the border, I think that it is possible to return more or less to what there was before, even if Israel leaders right now are saying that doing something like that, returning to the status quo before, is not possible. I think it becomes possible over time.
By the way, Nasrallah had a speech on a Tuesday, not his last speech, but the one before, saying that diplomats have offered nothing, like not withdrawal from occupied territories and not stopping the air violations. I tend to believe Nasrallah when he says this, especially if you consider how mad Western countries are behaving with the Palestinian issue now, like when it comes to the ceasefire. I tend to believe what Nasrallah is saying. Like I don't rule it out.
Sure. As I understand it, there has been in that French proposal. I might be misremembering this, but the one that sort of became public a couple of weeks ago, I thought there was something about reducing the number of flyovers and so, like there was meant to be some element of a concession by Israel. But in general, sure, I think that it does seem as though the Western-led mediation efforts are geared towards trying to stop Israel from expanding the war in a really serious way. And I think in part because Western diplomats have calculated that Hezbollah has established this clear pattern of preventing or trying to prevent a massive escalation, but not negotiating over this until there's a ceasefire in Gaza.
We see. Last question, and then you can add any point you want.
I think I've spoken enough, actually. I'll give you a question, though. Come on.
Feel free, by the way, yes. The solution in Palestine. Let's say there was a two-state solution in Palestine. It would not just affect the northern concern, for example. I would assume that it would affect the whole stability in between South Lebanon and Palestine, no? It would create stability, I mean.
In what sense?
Like, for example, we talk about how Israel tries to eliminate Hamas, to ease its danger, to relieve their people from the Hamas risk, you know?
But is your argument that if there was a two-state solution...
If they withdraw from occupied territories within Gaza and...
But this sounds like what you're suggesting is that would remove the kind of... the rationale for the resistance, right? Like, that's basically the argument.
I'm not saying this. I'm saying it would create at least stability in these regions without getting into Hezbollah's arms and resistance.
I think, for sure, and that's a separate question. Yeah. Look, I think...
Oh, you mean Hamas and Hezbollah?
No, but I think you make a good point. Of course, like a proper two-state solution, which involves an agreement and a settlement that's acceptable to the Palestinian people, would be some of the best news. In fact, probably the best news the region's received in decades.
Yeah.
Sure, sign me up.
One can only hope.
One can only hope.
Anyway, do you want to add anything before we...
Just my thanks for having me on. I'm glad to finally use Instagram for the first time, even though I did absolutely nothing. So
I did absolutely nothing as well. That's lonely.
200 people logged in.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know if it's good or bad, but what the rate is.
200 is not bad.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for watching us, and thanks to David, and thanks for Ronnie for your questions as well.
Great. Thanks for having us.
To you guys.
Cheers.
Cheers. All right.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.